The last thing Dr. Sarah Voss heard before the lights went out across the entire eastern seaboard was a USB port clicking into place. She had been awake for 31 hours. The coffee in her mug had gone cold 3 hours ago, and she hadn't noticed. The bay around her, a repurposed cargo container bolted to the underbelly of Relay Station Vantage, hummed with the low, pressurized frequency of recycled air and poorly cooled processors. Beyond the scratched porthole to her left, the dark side of the Earth turned slowly, city lights blinking out one by one, as the Oresh continued what they called a correction. Humans called it something else. Humans called it the end. She called it a reason to keep working. Stupid USB port, Sarah said, and jammed the cable in harder until the connector finally seated and the interface board flickered to life. Her partner, Dalen, was asleep in the chair behind her. She had covered him with her spare jacket an hour ago and had not looked back since. He would want to argue if he was awake. He always wanted to argue. That was fine. Arguing was what they did, had always done. Since the first grant cycle, when they'd shared a windowless basement office at Carnegie Mellon, and fought over whether the Feinberg equations allowed for macro-scale temporal displacement, or just the kind of quantum smearing that didn't do anyone any good. He had been wrong then, and he was wrong now, and she was going to prove it in the only way that mattered. She was going to do the test herself. The device was not beautiful. It had never been beautiful. It was a rig of salvaged Oresh signal harvesting hardware welded to a human neural interface chassis that she and Dalen had built over 14 months in this cargo container while the war went badly around them. The Oresh didn't have a word for war, as far as anyone had been able to translate. They had a word that meant something closer to arithmetic. A problem you worked until the numbers balanced, and then you stopped. Humanity was a number that didn't balance. The correction was their way of carrying the remainder. The device sat in the center of the bay, bolted to the deck. Two upright frames of signal-conducting alloy, one on each side of a chair that Sarah had taken from the station's break room. Between the frames, the air had a quality she could only describe as listening. The Oresh technology they'd reverse-engineered didn't generate fields the way human machinery did. It generated attention, a focused, invisible consideration of the space it occupied. She had never gotten used to it. The theory was this. The Oresh didn't travel through space to wage their corrections. They traveled through time. Not dramatically, not in the movie poster sense of vanishing in a flash and appearing in ancient Rome. They traveled precisely. Hours, days, sometimes a few weeks, ceding forward positions ahead of their main force, building a lattice of incursions before the target population had any idea the war had started. By the time anyone saw an Oresh ship, the Oresh had already been there for a month. Sarah had found the seam in that lattice. It was a bug. That was the word she kept using, even though Dalen hated it, told her it was sloppy thinking for what was actually a recursive calibration error in the Oresh temporal displacement algorithm. She called it a bug because bugs could be exploited, and she was the kind of person who found beauty in the word exploit. The bug meant that anything the Oresh device displaced forward in time would spawn a duplicate at the point of origin, not once, but daily, like a clock that hadn't been told to stop. Every Oresh soldier who had been pushed forward through time left a ghost behind. A ghost that snapped back, replayed, spawned again and again. She had tested it on an apple. The apple had disappeared from the left frame and appeared in the right one, 1 minute in its future. Then the next morning, another apple had appeared in the left frame, then another, then another. By day 4, the container smelled like a farmer's market. By day 7, when a pile of apples the height of the left frame's crossbar had accumulated, and she'd had to shovel them out, she was certain. The bug was real, the duplication was real. She had tested it on a mouse. The mouse had not survived, not because the device had failed, but because Dalen, trying to be gentle, had miscalibrated the neural buffer, and the mouse's system had been asked to exist in 2 temporal states at once. Which was, she now understood, approximately the same as asking it to exist in none. She had held the small, terrible thing in her palm, and she had not cried, because she didn't have time to cry. She had noted what had gone wrong, corrected it, and gotten back to work. Dalen didn't know she had corrected it. He thought she was still 2 steps behind where she actually was. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was breathing slowly, his mouth open slightly, the jacket she'd laid over him, risen and fallen. He had the kind of face that looked younger asleep than awake. She had spent 14 months in this container with that face, and she still wasn't tired of it, which she took as a good sign about their odds of surviving this. She turned back to the device. The face mask was the piece she was most proud of. The Oresh interface used a cortical sync protocol. The device had to know the shape of the mind it was displacing. Without the mask, the device couldn't distinguish her from the surrounding matter and would simply send everything in the frame forward, including the air and the chair, which would leave a brief and interesting vacuum behind. The mask was fitted with the same signal harvesting filaments as the main rig, designed to read the electrochemical signature of a human nervous system and say, clearly, in the machine's language, this, not this. She put it on. It smelled like soldering flux and the memory of the basement office at Carnegie Mellon. She buckled the chin strap. The filaments were cool against her temples and the back of her neck. Her heart was running faster than she wanted it to. She sat in the chair. The interface board showed all green. The calibration was perfect. She had run the pre-flight sequence 3 times in the past hour. She had walked through every deviation from the mouse calibration. She had checked the neural buffer twice. She was going to be fine. She was going to displace forward by 61 minutes, enough to emerge outside the station's standard Oresh monitoring window, observe whatever she observed, and snap back by morning. She thought about waking Dalen. She did not wake Dalen. She ran the sequence. The air between the frames went from listening to speaking. She felt the device's attention land on her like a searchlight, and then like a hand, and then like something that had no word in any human language, something that simply reached through the back of her skull and took hold of the specific singular arrangement of atoms and history and memory that was Sarah Voss and said, later, white, then the porthole, the dark side of the earth again, but the city lights were different. Some had come back. A cluster of them along the coast that had been dark for 3 weeks was burning again, orange and scattered, like a fire had been set rather than a grid restored. She pressed her hand to the porthole glass and it was cold and real. 61 minutes from now, she had done it. She sat very still for a few seconds, breathing, taking inventory. Her hands were hers. Her thoughts were hers. The device had sent precisely her and nothing else. The chair was empty. She was standing in the middle of the bay in her own future, and Dalen was still asleep in his chair, and the coffee mug on her workstation still held the dregs of the same cold coffee, and everything was exactly as it should be. Then she heard it. From the corridor outside the bay, a sound she recognized. The low, layered harmonic that the Oresh used for communication. Like several tuning forks struck at once in slightly different keys. They were on the station. She moved to the door panel without breathing and pulled up the corridor feed on the small monitor. 2 Oresh units were moving through the station's main passage, tall, 6-limbed, their carapaces the color of deep water, the 3 sensory clusters on their upper thorax, rotating in that slow, methodical sweep she'd seen in every piece of intelligence footage she'd studied. They moved like they owned the station. They moved like they had already done the arithmetic and had the answer. They were heading for the cargo bay. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at the device. She looked at the door. She had 61 minutes before she would snap back to the present. She also had, she realized, exactly this information. The Oresh were going to board this station in 61 minutes. She could not stop that from here, but she could remember it. And when she snapped back, she could warn Dalen, and they could move the device, and they could be somewhere else when the Oresh arrived. And they could keep working. She sat down in the empty chair. She waited. The harmonic in the corridor grew and faded. The Oresh passed the bay. She held herself perfectly still, perfectly silent, and continued toward the station's communications hub. Of course, they always went for communications first. The arithmetic of silencing a voice before it could add to the sum of resistance. When the harmonic had been gone for 10 minutes, she allowed herself to breathe. She spent the remaining time before the snap doing what she always did when she had nothing else available. She worked. She pulled up the device's memory log on the portable unit, the one that would travel back with her nervous system when she snapped, and she began noting every deviation from baseline, every unexpected reading, every fluctuation in the calibration record. She was looking for the ghost. She was looking for the signature of the duplication bug. She found it at minute 43. It was subtle. A secondary echo in the displacement record, a faint harmonic, not unlike the Oresh communication frequency actually, which made her stomach do something complicated, that suggested the device had not merely moved her, but had also, at the moment of displacement, begun generating a standing wave at the origin point, a daily pulse. If the pattern held to what she'd observed in the Apple trials, another Sarah Voss would appear in that chair tomorrow morning, and the morning after. and the morning after that. She was still staring at the number when the white took her. She woke on the bay floor with Dahlin crouching over her, his hand on her shoulder, saying her name in the specific frequency he used when he was frightened, but was trying not to show it. "I did it," she said. "You did it," he agreed, and he didn't sound happy about it. "You also didn't wake me up. You needed sleep." What I needed was to be there when my partner ran an untested human trial of a device that we built in a cargo container using alien parts. It worked. It absolutely worked, yes. And I'm very impressed, and we are going to have an extremely significant argument about this later. Right now, he helped her sit up. "Right now you need to tell me what you saw," she told him. "The Oresh, the corridor, the timeline, the communications hub." He listened with the focused silence he only deployed when the information was serious, his hands still, his eyes on her face. 61 minutes, he said. 58 now. He was already moving to the equipment lockers. "Then we have 58 minutes to break down the non-essential rig components and get the core unit to the secondary bay." "Dahlin, what?" "I found the duplication signature." He stopped. She told him that too. He turned slowly. His face went through several things. "So there's going to be another you tomorrow morning. And the morning after." I extrapolated from the Apple data. "The wave is already generating. I can't stop it. Every morning at the same time, a version of me snaps back to that chair from somewhere in the future. Or the future of the future. The versions will keep stacking." "How many?" "I didn't get all the way through the math." "Enough. Potentially." She hesitated. "Potentially a very large number. Define large. Enough to be a problem. Or enough to be an army, depending on how you look at it." Dahlin looked at the chair for a long time. "We're not going to have time to discuss this right now," he said. "No. But I want to note for the record that this is exactly the kind of development that would have been useful to know about before the human trial." Noted. They moved. The first duplicate appeared the next morning at Oresh 412 station time, exactly as predicted. A woman who looked precisely like Sarah, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same expression of someone who had just done something she wasn't sure was going to work. Sarah met her in the bay. The duplicate stood in the origin chair and blinked and took in the bay, and took in Sarah and said very quietly, "Oh, hello," Sarah said. "I was hoping this wouldn't be weird," the duplicate said. "It's very weird," Sarah told her. The duplicate turned out to be a version of Sarah from 11 days in the future. She didn't say much about those 11 days. Not yet, not immediately, but what she did say, carefully, in pieces, gave them enough. The Oresh weren't just correcting the station. The Oresh weren't just correcting the eastern seaboard, or the northern grid, or the coastal infrastructure. The Oresh had accelerated their timeline. The correction was not years away, it was weeks. "How many weeks?" Dahlin said. The duplicate was quiet for a moment. She looked at Sarah with an expression Sarah recognized because it was her own. "3, she said. "If we don't do something about it." They did something about it. The second duplicate arrived the following morning. She was from day 14, and she carried more information, and she had clearly been running hard. There was a bruise along her left jaw that Sarah didn't have, and she held her right wrist with the careful custody of someone managing pain they weren't going to complain about. She told them about the relay points. The Oresh lattice of forward incursions used a network of 7 relay nodes to maintain temporal coherence. Without the nodes, the incursions would begin to drift, and drifting incursions became detectable incursions. And detectable incursions became something a human defense grid could actually shoot at. "We need to take out the nodes," the second duplicate said. "We don't know where they are," Dahlin said. "You will," she said. "I found the map. Give me a terminal." She worked for 6 hours. Sarah worked alongside her, which was disorienting in a way she didn't have vocabulary for. Sitting next to yourself, finishing your own sentences, arguing with your own assumptions, but productive in a way that was almost funny. You couldn't bullshit yourself. You knew all your own deflections. When the second duplicate told her that her reasoning on the phase calibration was sloppy, Sarah believed her immediately because she would have said the same thing. The third duplicate arrived carrying a different kind of news. She was from day 19. She had the map. She had something else too. "They know about the device," she said, before she had fully oriented, before she'd even stood up from the chair. Her voice was flat and immediate. "The Oresh figured out what you built, not the full picture. They don't know about the duplication, I don't think, or they'd be handling this differently. But they know a human made a functional displacement unit, and they're looking for it." "How close are they?" Sarah said. "They're already on the station." She wasn't wrong. The harmonic came through the hull 40 minutes later, deeper than the patrol frequency, more resonant, the kind that meant a dedicated search team rather than a routine sweep. Dalen cut the bay's power draw to minimal to lower their thermal signature. The three of them, Sarah, the third duplicate, and a work team of station personnel they'd quietly recruited over the past several days, sat in the dark and breathed shallowly and listened. The harmonic swept the upper decks. Then the mid-ring. It paused near the communications hub, still dark, still wrecked from the Oresh's earlier visit, and then continued moving in their direction. The third duplicate leaned close to Sarah in the dark. She smelled like the cargo bay and machine oil, and something chemical that Sarah recognized as the specific residue of the secondary bay's ventilation system. Future Her had been spending a lot of time in secondary bay. "There's something I didn't tell you when I arrived," the third duplicate said. "I know," Sarah said, because she would have done the same thing. "The duplication. It's not stopping at 19. I did the math on the full cascade. The wave doesn't decay at a predictable rate. It's more like," she stopped. "You know how the apple pile kept growing? How it wasn't linear. The rate increased. The rate increased significantly, yes. How significantly? By day 30, the device will be spawning roughly 100 versions of you per day." Silence. "That's not," Dalen started. "I know," the duplicate said. "I know what it sounds like." "That's not a containment problem," he said slowly. "That's a tactical asset," Sarah said. Both of them looked at her. 100 versions of me, all arriving with information from different points in the future, all carrying different pieces of the picture. She was thinking fast now, the way she thought when the shape of something was almost visible. It's not a duplication error. It's a network. The Oresh built a correction machine that runs on temporal lattice integrity. We built the same thing accidentally, and what it's producing is a human temporal intelligence network. Every version carries what she learned from a different future. Every version brings back a different part of the map. The harmonic was very close now. "I love when you figure something out," the third duplicate said quietly. "Even when it's terrifying." "We're the same persons," Sarah said. "I know, it's still true." The harmonic reached their deck. What happened next was not something Sarah had planned, but it was something that later she would understand she had always been building toward. In the way that you sometimes look back at a sequence of decisions and see that each one was load-bearing, that you had been constructing something without a blueprint, and the thing you had constructed was the only thing that could have worked. The Oresh search team entered the bay through the upper access, which they had cut open with a field instrument that left the edges of the metal glowing amber. There were 4 of them. Their carapaces caught the emergency lighting and turned it blue-green, and their sensory clusters swept the room in methodical arcs, and they moved with the unhurried certainty of things that had already done the math. They were expecting one human, one device, one problem to balance. What they found was 43. The duplicates had been arriving for 3 weeks. Most of them had stayed. Not all. Some had insisted on returning to their own times, which the device allowed with a forward displacement that Sarah had worked out in the 3rd week. But enough. The ones who stayed had the specific motivation of people who had already seen what happened if they didn't stay. They had organized with the efficiency of a team that knew itself completely, argued without ego, delegated without hierarchy, and understood that every piece of information they carried from their respective futures was a day they had already survived, and a day that therefore could be survived again. 43 versions of Sarah Voss stood in that cargo bay. Each of them was different, not in the way of strangers, in the way of the same woman weathered by slightly different storms. Some had bruises, some had different clothes. Several had their hair cut short in a way the original Sarah hadn't gotten around to yet. One was wearing an Oresh field instrument on her wrist in a way that suggested she'd captured it and learned how to use it. And she had it raised and aimed. The Oresh search team stopped. Their sensory clusters swept the room. One of them, the tallest, the team lead, by the different configuration of the markings on its thorax, turned its cluster from face to face to face and then swept back, then forward again. Then back. It could not balance the equation. 43 identical faces, 43 pairs of eyes, 43 versions of one human standing between an alien search team and a device the aliens could not afford to let exist. "Hello," said Sarah, the original, or perhaps simply the one who had arrived here first, though the distinction felt less meaningful every day. She said it the way you said it when you were very calm and very sure. "We were wondering when you'd come." The team lead made a sound, not the search harmonic. Something higher and more discordant. a frequency she had heard in the intelligence recordings but never in person. It took her a moment to place it. It was the sound the Oresh made when their models failed. She had heard it described in debrief recordings. Every analyst who'd ever identified it had noted the same thing. It was a brief sound, quickly suppressed, almost immediately overridden by the resumed harmonic of functional operation. The Oresh recovered fast. They were adaptive. That was part of why the war had gone badly. But the sound meant that right now, for this moment, she had done the thing that human beings did better than any other species that had ever made the mistake of thinking humanity was a number that could be balanced. She had been unexpected. She had been so completely unexpected that for a fraction of a second, the Oresh team lead stood in her bay and did not know what to do. And in that fraction of a second, the 42 other Sarahs moved. Not violently. She wanted to be precise about this later, in the account she would eventually write and which would eventually matter. Not violently, because they had talked about this. Because 4 of the Sarahs present had already lived through versions of this exact confrontation and had brought back specific information about what worked and what didn't. Because they had, in the most literal sense possible, done this before, they moved toward the device. All 43 of them, in a coordinated pattern that looked chaotic but was precisely orchestrated, that broke the Oresh team's sensory tracking into 43 separate locks, none of which could be prioritized. The team lead reached for its field instrument. 3 Sarahs intercepted the reach, not attacking, just occupying the space the arm needed, human bodies in the way, persistent and warm, and absolutely uninterested in getting out of the way. The original Sarah sat in the chair. The device was already running. The pre-flight sequence had been initiated 14 minutes ago by the version of her who had arrived that morning from 3 days in the future, who had told them the exact time the Oresh would breach, who had handed them a window they had used correctly. Dallin was at the interface board, his hands ashore, his eyes on the calibration readout, his face the face he made when he was doing the thing he was best at, and he knew it. She put on the face mask. The filaments against her temples. The chin strap buckled. The device's attention landing on her like a question she had already answered. She looked at Dallin. "Don't wait up," she said. "I never do," he said. "Come back." "I always do," she said. The displacement was longer this time. Not 61 minutes, much longer. She had coded the target herself, run the calculations from the relay node map the 14th day duplicate had brought back, cross-referenced with the signal data the 19th day duplicate had extracted and captured Oresh field instrument. The target was not a time. The target was a place in the Oresh lattice. A seam between the relay nodes. A coordinate in their temporal architecture where the lattice was thin, where the recursive calibration error that she had spent 14 months studying sat like an exposed nerve. She was going to introduce herself to it. White, then, the lattice. She had no word for what she was seeing, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to find one. The best she would eventually manage was the inside of a decision. The Oresh temporal architecture was not a machine in any physical sense. It was a pattern, a mathematical structure given presence through the application of a technology so far beyond human engineering that the gap between the two felt less like distance and more like dimension. It was vast, and it was precise, and it was she could see immediately, based on a beautiful but bounded logic. It expected certain things to be true. It expected temporal displacement to occur in one direction. It expected the entities it displaced to occupy one timeline. It expected its calibration to be recursive but convergent, errors that corrected toward stability. It had not expected the bug. It had not expected her. She reached into the lattice with the interface, the captured Oresh field instrument, adapted over 3 weeks by a woman who had figured out its operating principles by the same method she'd figured out everything else. Stubbornly, in a cargo container, at 3 in the morning, and she introduced the bug into the relay node sequence. Not her bug. Not the accidental glitch that had been generating her duplicates. A different one, more targeted. One she had designed over 11 days, with the help of 43 versions of herself, who had each brought back a slightly different piece of the picture. The bug she introduced told the lattice a simple thing, that the relay nodes were not converging, that the calibration error was not correcting, that the arithmetic of the correction would not balance. She felt the moment it propagated. It moved through the lattice like a sound moving through a still room, cleanly, inevitably, touching everything. The Oresh architecture did what any sufficiently sophisticated error correction system did when given information it couldn't reconcile with its own model. It paused. It assessed. It ran the numbers again. The numbers didn't balance. She felt the lattice shift, not collapse. She was precise about this too later. The Oresh were not gone. The war was not over. The arithmetic of their correction still stood. It had been complicated but not erased. What she had done was introduce enough uncertainty into their temporal model that they could no longer trust the forward incursions that their strategy depended on. The lattice of presences they had seeded through time, the ghosts of soldiers already positioned ahead of their main force, was suddenly of unknown reliability, potentially corrupted, potentially compromised, potentially full of bugs of their own. The correction paused. The Oresh, she would later learn from signals intelligence, had a word for this. A word that did not translate well but was rendered by the analysts who studied it as recalculation. A pause in the arithmetic to ensure the numbers still made sense. She had bought time. She snapped back to the chair. Dalen was there. The 43 Saras were there. The Oresh search team was not. They had withdrawn at some point during her displacement, for reasons that the station's sensors captured as a sudden change in harmonic frequency from search to retreat. The bay was quiet and full of faces she recognized. She was tired in a way that went beyond sleep. She sat in the chair, and she didn't take the face mask off right away because she didn't have the energy. She just breathed. After a while, the duplicate from day 11, the first one, the first version of her to arrive, the one who had been here the longest and had the most bruises, sat down on the floor next to the chair. "Did it work?" she said. "I think so," Sarah said. "For now." "How long is for now?" "Long enough," Sarah said. "Long enough for us to do the next thing. And the thing after that." The duplicate was quiet. Then she said, "I've been thinking about something." "I know," Sarah said. "Me too. We can't both stay forever." "No, at some point the duplication wave has to be collapsed. At some point there needs to be one of us. I know. The device can do it. The reverse sequence. We talked about it, you and I. You'll think of it in about 4 days." "How does it feel?" Sarah said. "When it happens." The duplicate considered this honestly. "Like going home," she said after a moment. "Like remembering something you'd almost forgotten was true." Sarah nodded. Around them, the other Sarahs were moving, working, doing what they did. The specific industry of people who could not afford to stop, who had looked at the arithmetic of the situation and decided that it was not beyond them, that they had seen worse numbers balance, that they were the kind of people who built things in cargo containers at 3 in the morning and kept going when the mouse died and corrected the code and ran the trial themselves. Around them, the station was quiet in the way that stations were quiet when the thing that had been hunting them had decided to recalculate. Outside the porthole on the dark side of the Earth, new lights were coming on. She was not naive enough to think the lights meant it was over. The Oresh would finish their recalculation. They would adjust. They were adaptive, precise, and patient, in a way that human beings had to work very hard to match. The correction would resume. There would be more mornings in this bay, more face masks, more sequences run, more versions of herself arriving in that chair, carrying information from futures she had not yet survived. But she had given the planet 3 weeks. Possibly more. 3 weeks was enough to do the next thing. She finally unbuckled the chin strap and took off the mask. The filaments peeled away from her temples with the soft sound of something releasing. She set the mask on the console beside the chair, and she looked at Dalen, and he looked back at her with the expression he'd had in the basement office at Carnegie Mellon the morning after the night they'd finally cracked the Feinberg equations. Not happy, exactly, because happy was too small a word for it, and they were both too tired for happy anyway. Something quieter than happy and more durable. Something like, "We're not done yet." Something like, "Good." The interface board logged a cascade event in the lattice network, he said. "I know. You want to tell me what exactly you introduced into their system." "A bug," she said. He looked at her. "Sarah. A very well-designed, precisely targeted, thoroughly researched bug. It's more time cop than Back to the Future, but it gets the job done." He laughed. It was a brief sound, a little raw, the laugh of someone who hadn't laughed in a while and was surprised to find they still could. Around the bay, a few of the other Saras glanced over. One of them smiled, recognizing the exchange, having heard some version of it before. "What do we do now?" Dalen said, when the laugh had settled. She stood up from the chair. Her legs were steady. Her hands were hers. "We fix the bug," she said. "The real one, the duplication cascade. We figure out how to collapse it safely, without losing the intelligence network before we've extracted everything it can give us. We use the time the recalculation bought us to build something better. Something they won't see coming because we haven't done it yet, and neither have they." And after that, she picked up the cold coffee mug. She looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. There's always an after that, she said. That's kind of the whole point. Outside the porthole, the earth turned. The lights on the dark side kept coming on. Not many, not enough, not yet. But more than before, a city here, a grid there. Small, bright arguments against the dark, the kind of lights that meant people were alive and working, and had not, despite everything the arithmetic suggested, stopped. She got back to work. On a morning 6 days later, at 0412 station time, the chair in the cargo bay was empty. No displacement signature, no standing wave echo. The cascade had been collapsed. There was only one Sarah Voss. She was enough.